been given the job to introduce myself, and I'm told to go on for a little bit because it's important. I'm just thinking just what I like, to go on for a little bit. I'm Kristin King, for those of you who know me. For those of you who don't know me, I guess I could make up something and pretend to be someone else. I've been here at the college since 1995 as a teacher. I teach English and writing and all sorts of eras of literature. I also have done a great deal of administration, and most recently I was president for 5 years. So I'm back in the classroom now, and I feel very blessed to enjoy teaching and administration and research. So whatever you throw at me, I'll probably end up liking it. So I think that's good. So welcome, thank you for coming. I'm particularly pleased to see one of my English majors here, Michael DeSalvia. Thanks for coming. So let's begin. And just a little bit of an overview. I want to talk about what led me to do the research for this book. And then I'll spend most of the time talking about the three main areas in the book. And this is garden correspondences, and then gardens in heaven, and then gardens in history. And I should say with the gardens in history, I don't cover the Far East, Japan, China, Russia. It's more the Western tradition there. And then finally, I'll end on Swedenborg's garden and maybe do some speculation on that if there's time. So why I pursued this study. About 20 years ago, I developed an overwhelming love of gardening. Now, I had loved trees as a child, but not really gardening. I think I associated gardening with weeding the rose beds, which was my parents' way to reward us for fighting. So, not great associations there. And my parents' approach was not only to make us work and work in the garden, but if we were cranky or complained about it, we had to keep at it until we were having fun. Or at least the appearance of being cheerful, which really seems brutal in a way. But actually, I think this mandatory cheerful gardening, as I think of it, is a powerful image or appearance of what it means to head back in the direction of Eden. And that is to be useful and to enjoy your work so much that it doesn't feel like labor. That's what it means to be in Eden. So I began gardening voluntarily in my late 30s. I started to plant extensive gardens and spent hours enjoying weeding and pruning and planting. The fecundity of the earth was really outrageous, startling. And I think that's an image for the infinity and the eternity of God, and Swedenborg says as much. I marveled at the absurdity of dropping seeds, these tiny little humble dry things, into the dirt and splashing them with a hose, and then finding green stuff come up a few weeks later, and then buds and blossoms. Seemingly overnight, a tightly packed bud will unfurl into an 8-inch blossom, a lavish display of color, scent, and texture. How does that happen? I think it's a miracle that never gets old. And it's a metaphor not only for divine love, but for human potential as well. G.K. Chesterton said, "If seeds in the black earth can turn into such beautiful roses, what might not the heart of man become in its long journey toward the stars?" Growing things made me feel connected to gardeners of the past and to all the communities of people who love plants and share cuttings and beauty and enthusiasm and knowledge. My father grew roses, as I mentioned, but mostly I remember houseplants wedged into every sunny corner of every room. or loaded onto the sunken sun porch of our Midwestern home. It wasn't until I was older that I found out that the sunken porch was not an intentional architectural feature, but the result of my father's excessive celebration of anything that had the guts to grow. I think that was his child-rearing thoughts as well. He once told me that people think the leaves of one houseplant should not touch another. But it was obvious that he did not much truck with that nonsense. He would crowd pots together, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes using one plant to prop a drooping neighbor, or shove 4 or 5 different species into a single pot. Danielle, don't be horrified. Letting their branches not only touch, but interlace as they grew. While my father liked whatever survived, my mother was more selective, choosing color and texture, shape and line to make beautiful arrangements. I got to thinking in later years, when I became a gardener myself, that both approaches are needed. It is important to stand in awe of what grows, the life force that just keeps pushing through every unlikely scenario, but also important to be selective and to shape things for beauty and context and meaning. We are both observers and participators. I've also been affected by the literary aspect of gardens, by the writers and poets who help us appreciate the incredible beauty of the natural world, especially as a garment of the divine force behind it. Whether we are William Wordsworth or Emanuel Swedenborg or Mary Oliver, we come to see that it is not the flower or tree itself that matters, but the way that flower or tree or garden inspires reflection and the possibility of walking through a doorway into new meaning. Take, for instance, Mary Oliver's poem about the connection between looking carefully at nature and praying. It doesn't have to be the blue iris, Oliver says. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. In another poem entitled Praying, Oliver describes the perfect prayer of the lily, closing up at night and opening again every morning, saying in lily language with a hidden tongue some small words we cannot hear. So I'm interested in the way plants and gardens speak to us words we cannot hear, the way they can be doorways to our inner selves, or symbolic thresholds between worlds. So let me say something about thresholds. Swedenborg meditated in and on his earthly garden as a threshold to spiritual experiences. He both taught and learned in gardens in the other world, and he describes newcomers entering heaven through gardens. The thought of heaven as a garden is common to most cultures. In fact, the oldest word for garden, paradise, from the Persian, is really a synonym for heaven. So finally, I've been studying gardens, including what Swedenborg says about them, or working in gardens and enjoying their constant flux and beauty can provide fertile ground for sowing thoughts of heaven. So, on to the first topic, garden correspondences. We're going to look at the Garden of Eden, which represents that celestial or unfallen state, and then look at gardens in general, which represent intelligence or rational thought, and that's the ground for the work of regeneration. And then gardens as images for the Word. So the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden represents the earliest people. A garden in Eden from the east signifies 3 things. The garden is intelligence. The garden in Eden, that very particular garden, is the celestial state of knowing from love. And from the east means facing the Lord in all things. Now, the most ancients knew things immediately from love and attributed all things to the Lord. They had very little sense of pride or labor or ownership. Wouldn't that be nice? Swedenborg describes these people as living in actual and figurative gardens because they had a garden within them. Everywhere they went, they took heaven with them. When they fell away from loving the Lord above all and started subordinating heaven to earth, they lost that internal paradise. That is, they lost Eden. So, being sent out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground means losing understanding of truth, that is, leaving a garden, losing a will for love, leaving that particular Garden of Eden, and tilling ground outside of Eden means being dislocated from God or killing charity. It's not tilling or work that is the issue, and I think this is important. It's that we do it outside of Eden. We work no matter what. The question is whether it feels like punishment or blessing. In Swedenborg's view, work is not punishment but salvation. Heaven is a kingdom of uses with every angel filling a particular need and working joyfully for the good of the whole. The Lord's yoke is easy because he does the heavy lifting for us. But we still need to plow and plant and weed the field. This emphasis on a working paradise, let me say that again, a working paradise, is probably the most distinctive feature of Swedenborg's descriptions of Eden, of gardens in general, and of heaven. So I just want to point out here, and I brought, so proud of myself, I found a laser pointer and I realized it doesn't work on the TV screen. So I'll just have to use my words. These are the garden motif ornaments from the writings, and on the left, you'll see a gardener with a shovel. This is the front piece to the Arcana, which is all about losing Eden and then trying to regain it. And then the ornament on the right, a little harder to see, but in the lower right corner, there's a cherub watering a plant. And this is used on the title page of 8 other works of the writings. So I think that gardening is out there in some measure, as Swedenborg is publishing his works. Okay, we are all fallen from that early state described as a garden in Eden, but we work our way back to Eden, to the fruitfulness of a heavenly life, by allowing the Lord to regenerate us. And the Lord can do this only if we repent and change our ways. And Swedenborg likens the work of repentance to weeding. How many of you have done any weeding? Did you ever have to do it again? Yes. So, can anyone work over a piece of ground thick with thorns, briars, and nettles to make a garden until he has uprooted those weeds? That's from True Christianity. And then once these evils are removed, which is repentance, then we can be grafted onto the Lord like a branch onto a vine, and that's Reformation. And then comes fruit, and that's regeneration. So, if we want to be fruitful gardens, that is, have Eden within us, we first must be gardeners, and we must ultimately acknowledge that the work and the fruit are both the Lord's. So, on to our second of our topics under garden correspondence, and this is gardens as intelligence and rational thought. Does this sound still all right? Yes. Am I banging it and making an annoying noise? Only one time? Points off. Okay. So the majority of references to gardens in the Word are not to Eden. We've left Eden by chapter 2, and then a mere schmear 1,187 chapters about trying to get back to Eden. Subsequent references to gardens generally signify the possibility of regeneration, of recovering a paradise within. Gardens represent intelligence or rational thought, which is the means by which we can be regenerated. In heaven, a person's rational capacity appears as a garden when the Lord flows into it. But in order to get to heaven, we need to be regenerated. And that means weeding and sowing, and weeding and weeding, and hoping the Lord makes something grow. So the third area under correspondences is the word as a garden. Swedenborg describes the word as being, quote, like a garden, a heavenly paradise in which are delicacies and delights of every kind. And that's from the Doctrine of Sacred Scripture. He also describes the excitement and beauty of seeing the internal sense not through the explanation of isolated phrases, this equals that, but when everything is presented, quote, in a single sequence of thought, which is like seeing a heavenly paradise from an earthly one. And that's from the Arcana. Not only is the word described repeatedly as a garden, but garden imagery pervades the scriptures, from well-watered Eden and the Song of Solomon to all the gardens and vineyards in the New Testament. Christ is taken prisoner in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he appears as a gardener when Mary first sees him after the resurrection. Finally, in the other world, the word itself appears in various forms within heavenly gardens. So, the second major area of study after garden correspondence is the actual gardens in heaven. Swedenborg describes visiting 6 heavenly gardens, but he also describes gardens in general. He teaches and learns in these gardens, and he tells us that they are indescribably beautiful, 1,000-fold more so than anything on earth. Very enticing. That said, the descriptions he does give are surprisingly disappointing. I mean, really disappointing. But don't worry, I came out the other side. It's as if he is being told not to describe them, or as if he is being distracted by something more important than the appearance of the gardens. There are more than 6 gardens, obviously. Heaven is nothing but an infinite variety of garden landscapes. And here's a sampling of passages illustrating this. Everywhere in the heavens, gardens appear, producing leaves, flowers, and fruits, according to the states of the church with the angels. From the soil in heaven, nothing but youth blooms forth. People who love truth and do good live in gardens. Those gardens change every day. And yet it's impossible to describe the gardens and how they reflect inner states, Swedenborg adds. The phenomenon of the gardens reflecting inner states is achieved in a celestial manner which no one except those in heaven can conceive, nor can it ever be expressed in words. I've done a number of other studies about this phenomenon of Swedenborg saying, here's something fantastic and I can't explain it to you or put it in words. So I think it's an interesting tension in his work. I also think it should give us just a little bit of humility about how perfectly we grasp everything that's in there. Okay, so the function and uses of these indescribably beautiful gardens. There's more than this, but these are some that I've found. One is that they are a gateway to the next life. The newcomers, as I said, enter through gardens. They're a means for disillusioning those who have a fantasy about heaven being a place for leisure. They are the site of orientation for learning about heaven. So people go from one kind of garden to a more spectacular, more and more spectacular as their ideas get more complex. And they give ongoing feedback for angels about their state of mind and heart, because the angels are always doing self-examination and repentance, and their gardens help them do this. So Swedenborg visited 6 gardens, and the first is the Temple of Wisdom garden. In this garden, there's a great deal of attention given to the route Swedenborg takes to get there. He has an angel guide. There's a curved way lined with palm trees and laurels, a locked gate, an angel guard. There's really no description of the garden itself, but the temple at the center is replicated in smaller temples throughout the garden. And I think this is very interesting. It provides an image of the infinite growth of intelligence and wisdom, which Swedenborg says, quote, is capable of growth as a tree grows from seeds and woods and gardens from trees. For here, there is no limit. And that's from Conjugal Love. The second garden is Andromedoni, the delights of marriage love. And similar to the Temple of Wisdom garden, Andromedoni has a curved way and a locked gate and an angel guard. But the garden is also even more secure and embedded. The curved path becomes a spiral. One gate leads to a bridge and then another gate. There are olive trees with vines running between them and flowering shrubs. And then a grassy circle in the middle with married couples sitting on the grass around a leaping fountain at the center. The couples are learning about use, especially the way that use turns love and wisdom into reality. I like that expression, love and wisdom into reality. I see the fruit of this particular garden as education. Learning is proceeding by question and answer. Swedenborg says that an impression does not last unless the hearer also thinks about it for herself or himself and asks questions. That's from Conjugal Love. This, I think, is wonderful inspiration for education at the college, where we take hold of knowledge and truth and turn it around and ask questions and think about these things in terms of love and use. The third garden is one that's emanating from a long married couple. We move from married couples sitting in a garden in Andromedoni to an angel couple wearing a garden. It seems very postmodern. Buckle your seatbelt here. From a distance, Swedenborg sees two naked children. As they approach, he sees them dressed in flowers. They have wreaths on their heads, and bands of lilies and blue roses hang across their chests from shoulder to hip. There's a woven garland of olive leaves that bind the two together. As they come even closer, Swedenborg sees that they are not children, but adults, and that they are wearing clothing that has garden imagery woven into it. And then they come right up next to Swedenborg, and they breathe upon him a sweet scent of gardens. They then ask him what he saw, and after he tells them, they say, okay, since this is what you saw, then we will teach you about the concept of useful life as the foundation of love. What I like most about this garden is the interplay between a constantly changing surface and a very stable core. In a short span, Swedenborg sees children who are wearing nothing turn into adults wearing flowers, and then flowers turn into clothing with a garden motif woven into it. The angel couple, however, does not have the same experience as Swedenborg. They actually laugh pleasantly, but they do laugh at his description, saying they did not experience any of that, but felt that they were just as they are now and as they have been for centuries. So there can be stability in heaven, but also constant learning from the appearance of a changing environment, depending on what angels or visitors need to learn. Then the fourth garden is a pair of visits to rose gardens. One morning, Swedenborg looks out of his summer house window toward the east, which is a rose garden, and he's transported to a heavenly rose garden set out in a rainbow of color. I think many of you may be familiar with this memorable relation. He talks with 7 angel wives. They teach him about conjugal love. And as a result, he feels lifted up and made, quote, capable of more inward and clearer perception than ever before. I think this is a great advertisement for female instruction. He takes his knowledge back to test on earthly wives who deny what the angel wives have said. So he goes back to the angel wives and says, well, they said, no, that wasn't true. And they sort of look at him and say, really, what were you expecting? It's a great moment. I don't know what the tone is, but I can't help reading some tone in there. The husbands then appear with good and bad grapes to illustrate what the wives have been teaching Swedenborg. And then a young boy appears with a written text that he holds out for Swedenborg to read. The passage is about conjugal love, which is also the book Swedenborg is writing at the time, and the book that we are reading 250 years later. And all of this is happening at once. I love the back and forth between Swedenborg and the wives, but also between worlds, with a natural and spiritual rose garden as a kind of portal. The written text comes as an ultimate authority, and like the word, a medium of conjunction between worlds. Swedenborg looks up from his writing to gaze at an earthly rose garden, and he ends up by reading aloud in a heavenly rose garden, a passage that we read simultaneously in our own minds. The two rose garden scenes beautifully collapse writers, readers, and texts across the threshold of two worlds and two times. So, good on you, Swedenborg. It's a great moment. The fifth garden is a wedding garden. And I like to call this the Holy Thunder and Lightning Batman garden, which doesn't sound very reverent, but I mean it in the most reverent way. I think it's a great garden scene. We see a park and an avenue leading to a small palace. The guard admits Swedenborg to an inner garden of a newly married couple. Swedenborg follows an avenue of trees, lots of different fruit trees, branches interlacing, and then he enters a smaller garden, all sorts of shrubs and flowers there, and then he comes to the house where the newlyweds are. He enters the house, is overwhelmed by their faces radiating this mutual love. He offers his congratulations, and then he goes back out into the garden where he sees a group of men having a conversation about marriage love. A wise man is speaking about the Lord's providence and the marriage of will and understanding, not only between partners, but within each individual, as well as between and within every organ of the body. Then comes an interruption. First lightning, then thunder. These provide a warning that something is missing in this conversation. We learn that the quality of the light on the left, which is truth relating to the understanding, depends on the quality of the light on the right, or good relating to the will. Priority is thus given to the right side for the good of charity and the good of life. My reading of this garden scene in the context of the angel wives in the rose garden, and in the context of that radiating love from the actual faces of the married couple at the beginning, is that the group of men talking among themselves in the garden need some not so subtle reminder, thunder and lightning, that their views are not sufficient by themselves. It's a nice sort of political charge, I think, to the atmosphere there. And then the last garden is a spiral of trees garden, or the Prince's Garden. And this appears in True Christianity. Swedenborg travels with a group of visitors this time. He has an angel guide, and the angel advertises this garden as particularly magnificent, even by heavenly standards. So we're getting ready for something exciting. The visitors, however, are disappointed because they just see one tree. The guide says, this is the tree of life, and if their spiritual eyes are open, they will see the garden. And they do. Their eyes are open and they see the garden. It's an unbroken spiral of many species of trees, arranged in order of nobility of their fruit. First is the tree of paradise, which Swedenborg says, I can't describe it, we don't have anything like it on earth. But after that comes oil-yielding trees, then wine-yielding trees, fragrant trees, and finally trees that yield wood for building things. There's benches, more flower gardens, and gates. The visitors, who could not at first see anything, now exclaim, here is heaven made visible. And we learn that to see this garden, one must love to be useful for its own sake. This aptly describes the prince himself, who loves to serve rather than be served. The beautiful garden is thus an effect, not a display of authority. And this is a contrast, I think, to some of the grandiose gardens I'll be talking about in history. The garden tour ends with the angel guide giving the visitors detailed instruction about the meaning of every plant, none of which we get. None of it. So that's okay. It's frustrating, but it also tells tells me that we don't get to experience those gardens until we have become ourselves the gardens that spring from useful lives. So I just found this in the archive. Apparently Swedenborg did bring back a photograph. This is the tree of life. And I guess he also invented photography. But I thought that was a pretty picture. So the final area of study is gardens in history. After that whirlwind tour of heavenly gardens, let's look at some gardens closer to home. What is a garden? Is it vegetables? Is it flowers? Is it trees? Is it something intentional? Is it something we just find? People don't agree on how to define gardens, and one person's favorite plant is someone else's nightmarish weed. So, there's no way of really getting your hands around what gardens are. Additionally, gardens change through seasons, and they change across time. They're very ephemeral. The more I study gardens, the more I think it isn't about what gardens are. It is about what responses they elicit and what qualities they reflect. Part of the value of speculating on why civilizations built gardens in the past, I think, is to reflect on why we create gardens in the present. What do we want and what do we value? Is it beauty? Is it order, ingenuity, community, reflection and worship or wonder, humility, meditation? Maybe it's just appreciation for the life cycles. I think one of the most exciting, though admittedly modest, developments in recent gardening is the urban vegetable gardens. Very humble things, but they're popping up on balconies and in rain barrels and in deserted lots in the center cities, in the worst parts of the center cities. And it's miraculous to see the transformative and healing power of showing children who have grown up on asphalt and violence and poverty, showing them how to put their hands into the earth and plant seeds, tend them, and then harvest and share and eat what grows. These humble efforts, in my view, are some of the most heavenly gardens on earth at the present time. And I imagine Swedenborg would love these gardens. A little bit of history. Gardens that we know about from the past are a very selective lot. If they made it into the travel logs or the history books, they tended to represent the amassing of wealth. I can think of worse things to spend money on than gardens, and concentrations of wealth are often the seedbed for culture and art. But we'll also see a decadent tendency to use gardens to parade wealth and power, which really is the opposite of heavenly gardens. So there's 6 major stages from the ancient Middle East through Greece and Rome and Islam, early Middle Ages, Renaissance, and ending with Swedenborg's era. So first, the ancient Middle East. 6,000 to 4,000 BCE, nomads start to settle down to farm in the Tigris and Euphrates Delta. And then 1,000 years later, around 3,000 BCE, these people develop irrigation and drainage, and they really turn that delta into what we call the Fertile Crescent. And then there's an amassing of wealth and power as the empire develops, and you see big hunting parks and exotic plants and animals being imported from far away. The 2 main legacies of these gardens is water management and these big parks. And those big parks come down to us as the medieval royal parks, 18th century landscape gardens, and also our own urban gardens, places like Central Park. And then ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is not as grandiose as the ancient Sumerian and Assyrian, Mesopotamian. Mostly they were enclosed gardens, protected from the flooding of the Nile. The features of them, very familiar to you, I'm sure: trellises and trained vines, terraces, tiled walls, sunken gardens, fish ponds, usually a rectangular pool at the center, lots of geometric line and symmetry, and twin trees at the center. Kind of a throwback to Eden there. Some of the uses of these Egyptian private gardens were for pleasure and shade and worship. They would grow plants for medicine or food, cosmetics. And there was a time during the Middle Kingdom, I think this is very interesting, about a 500-year period, when women would labor and give birth in a special bower in a garden. I think that'd be nice to be born in a garden. It's sort of like getting back to Eden. And that's just a drawing of an ancient garden, what we speculate they might have looked like, a private garden. Ancient Egypt also had larger gardens, really of two kinds. There were temple gardens that would grow flowers for ritual and for worship, and then royal gardens, which were basically avenues of trees, sacred to the gods. But eventually these became just to display power, as so often happens. Human beings amass wealth, and it's often downhill from there. And the power would obviously be, if you can grow an avenue of trees in the desert, you are pretty powerful. There's an interesting descent or corruption in the symbolism in the Egyptian gardens. You begin with all these different flowers representing different qualities of the one god, and then they start representing different qualities of all the different gods, and then even worse, they start representing all the great qualities of our divine ruler. The snake, which represents the sensual level, and you remember Moses picks up the snake, and then it's very useful. You can do all sorts of things if you have it in control, but we have the snake being worshipped as a deity in Egypt. So, and then the land of Goshen, an image of Eden, becomes a land of grief and slavery. And I would say that the pyramids are really a wonderful image of the opposite of a heavenly garden, because the pyramids were built on slavery. They deify a human ruler. They're kind of like the ego on steroids. There's really just no point other than self-aggrandizement. And they bear testament to the trappings of power, but they don't tell us much about the quality of the rulers who created them. So in heaven, by way of contrast, angels scarcely think at all about the beautiful gardens surrounding them, which is why I think we get so little description. Instead, they reflect upon the thoughts and loves and uses that lie behind the gardens. So now on to ancient Greek and Roman gardens. And Greece first. Greece is really too arid to have lush gardens, but it was the birthplace of botany and democracy. So that's a pretty important contribution. There are more than 6,000 species of plants in Greece. And the Greeks primarily were after medicinal values. You may have heard of Hippocrates. So by the 5th century, Hippocrates is writing things down and starting practical medicine. Probably the most interesting use of the Greek gardens was as settings for conversation and education. The outdoor academies of Socrates and Plato. These philosophical debates took place outside the city limits, and they modeled intellectual freedom and humanism and a healthy republic, all good things. It's interesting that Swedenborg so often describes debates and dialogues in outdoor forums in heaven, and I think we should create some of those on the college campus so we can put on our togas and have great conversations about healthy education. Now the Roman gardens. The Romans, of course, drew on the Greeks. They basically stole everything from the Greeks, including horticultural ideas. But the Romans made major advancements in engineering, especially aqueducts and plumbing, and this allowed for some very lavish gardens. There were pools and fountains everywhere and plants from all over that vast Roman territory. So a couple of pictures of Roman gardens. You can see the use of waterworks there, celebration of the human form. Another beautiful Roman garden, lots of symmetry there. And again, quite a sense of scale and beauty. As the Roman Empire grew, they developed vast pleasure gardens, huge tracts of land taken up for these gardens. And this really came at the cost of their own agriculture, increasing dependency then on food created political instability. If we think of heavenly gardens as representing balance between good and truth, or the rational level that mediates between the inner and outer self, or as usefulness itself, then these vast pleasure gardens that create political instability and take away a food supply, I think are a wonderful inversion of that kind of sense of the Nephilim, things being out of balance and overgrown. Seneca satirizes the unnaturalness of planting forests on rooftops so that roots are where the tops of trees should be. And that, I think, is a wonderful image of overreaching hubris or pride. So we move now to the Islamic world. Now, Christian Europe in the Middle Ages, and that's the time between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance, really lost the knowledge of botany and gardening, and we can be very grateful to the Islamic world for preserving those things for us. Islamic gardens tend to have a balance of earthly delight and heavenly beauty. They're places for peace and reflection, for quiet, for privacy, and they're often behind walls, stone walls. Running water, very important, often coming through beautifully tiled channels, but coming to rest in pools and coming to rest and being still so that that pool can reflect the sky, which represents heaven. So this beautiful sense of the presence of heaven in Islamic gardens. So there's one garden, and you can see the channels and the tile and the reflecting pools. Very peaceful and pretty. In addition to symmetry and continuity, there is an emphasis on shade. Obviously, these are generally desert climates, so shade is a wonderful thing to have. No images of God in these gardens, but a tremendous amount of floral imagery, vegetable motifs, and these are carved on everything to represent that heaven is supposed to be everywhere in our worldly life. And these floral and garden motifs are also sewn and woven, fired into the textiles, painted and patterned on the mosaics of the walls and the floors and the ceilings. Has anybody here been or seen the Alhambra in Spain? It's a beautiful palace that illustrates many of these traits of the gardens. I have a photo of it. But here's another Islamic garden. You can see the peacefulness of it and the privacy, water at the center. There's another, you see the twin trees at the center, lots of symmetry, channels of water. Beautiful flowers here, but in a very peaceful color coordination. And then this is stonework, which basically looks like flowers. This is the Alhambra. Between 700 and 1500, the Islamic influence came up through Spain with the Moors, as they were called. And the Muslims brought all sorts of new plants and mosaic and garden design that came up into Europe, and that was the rebirth. They preserved the knowledge of botany from the Greeks and the technology from the Romans. And I really love the way that these civilizations that do their best to try to wipe each other out, as Christianity and Islam has done in the past, are actually end up having something as ephemeral as gardens persist and cultivate us in spite of ourselves. And so we now enjoy all these traits of Islamic gardens, and we share that culture. So on to medieval gardens. I'm not going to spend much time here. Monastery and castle gardens, for the most part, very modest, very humble, mostly to grow a couple of plants for medicine. Those gardens really reflect mistrust of the senses and the natural world. There were herb gardens by the late Middle Ages, and eventually some flowers permitted here and there, but for worship, and they had been shunned because there was an association with the pagan world, flowers and ritual. Gradually, this castle garden, the medieval garden, moved outside the walls of the castle and the eye would start to go to the periphery of the estate. And that's really the transition to the Renaissance garden and to landscape gardens. So, Renaissance gardens. The Renaissance overall is a return to appreciating antiquity and celebrating the human. There's a renewed delight in the natural world, very unlike the church-controlled Middle Ages. So gardens once again become places for socializing, for intellectual debate, lots of hedges and pergolas or walkways, perspective and geometric design, and a lot of emphasis on manipulating nature to reflect our own control. The dark side of this is, I think, an overconfidence in our own abilities and power. And so you get kind of Walt Disney, bushes turned into Walt Disney creatures. Has anybody been to Versailles? Yeah. I didn't love Versailles, but I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings if you did. Here's a Renaissance garden. You can see the geometric design, pretty fancy. There we have just maybe a little bit of pride. I don't know. And there's Versailles. And then on to Swedenborg's era and his garden. And I'm not going to go beyond Swedenborg's era, but I think 7,000 years was enough. I'll leave the last 200 for you just to study on your own. During the century before Swedenborg's birth in 1688, there were 20 times more plants coming into Europe than in the previous 2,000 years. There was an explosion of botany and plant-related study at this time, and an incredible drive to describe and classify and illustrate every plant. Linnaeus, I'm sure you've heard of, was a very pivotal figure at this time. He was a relative by marriage. He was married to Swedenborg's cousin. They lived in the same town for a while, and people speculate that they no doubt ate dinner together a lot. Linnaeus would take long walks in the woods and bring back specimens for his study. He was famous for that. Swedenborg was also a nature lover and an avid walker. He was a careful observer, and he brought the language of science into his theology. But he could not bring back physical specimens from his otherworld travel, only figurative approximations, linguistic approximations of what he had seen. I went into my study wishing for a guide like Linnaeus, but I came out the other side being grateful for Swedenborg and his emphasis on use and the human beauty and energy behind the gardens, rather than on classification and description. When he was 55 years old, Swedenborg bought a home and laid out a garden. This was the same time that his spiritual experiences became his life work. It's interesting that he literally put down roots in the natural world at the same time that the Lord was transplanting him to the spiritual world. We know at least some, that was an interesting sound. We know some of what was in his garden. The plants are listed on the margins of an almanac on the reverse side of where he's doing instructions about publishing the Arcana. So I think that's really nice. Flip sides of this page. The final notation refers to his American seeds: mulberry, melon, buttonwood, beech, dogwood, and an unidentified pod-bearing tree. I find it poetic that these American seeds that were imported for his Swedish garden really mirror a later transatlantic movement, as the seeds of his theology went back and were sown deeply in the American soil. And look at the fruit right out here. So here's a photo of an 18th century garden, except for the car in the background. But this gives you an idea of the symmetry in these gardens. And this is a drawing or a speculation of what that garden would look like. You can see the 18th century structure to it and the quadrants. And this, you may be more familiar with this drawing, We have at the west end, number 10 on the right-hand side, that's the summer house where he wrote. Down towards the bottom here, see number 8 is the Mirror Playhouse. There's an English pavilion right in the middle. At the east end is his house. So lots of different features in this garden. It was just over an acre big, full of plants and paths and outbuildings and fanciful structures to appeal to visitors. Swedenborg enjoyed working in his garden. He was very generous to his gardeners. The garden was a place for reflection, meditation, and prayer. He wrote theology in the summer house at the west end of the property. At times, the garden seemed to transport him to spiritual experiences. It was a humble, beautiful location or backdrop for his extraordinary intellectual labor of love. And I thought I would end by reading just a passage from my book that describes how I feel about the garden, which I hope someday we will build on the college campus. Swedenborg's garden was laid out along formal lines, but with eccentricities and flourishes, all nicely reflecting Swedenborg's own mind, open but protected, useful and abundant with life. Reproducing a drawing and a list of plants does little to recreate the experience of a garden, just as reading about correspondences is nothing like the actual experience of them. To know Swedenborg's garden, we would have to stand under the arch and smell the lilies, roses, catmint, and chamomile, watch the heavy sunflowers sway in the Swedish breeze, or the heads of tulips turn gently into the frail warmth of the northern sun. We might hear the soft thud of apples dropping on the ground, or glimpse birds darting from beech to buttonwood to cypress, or trace the stumble of bees through pollen and mulberry sting. What is most spectacular, finally, about this nearly forgotten plot of sown ground that was Swedenborg's garden is its sheer commonness. The same plants grow in thousands of gardens across Europe and the United States, probably in our own garden or the one next door. This is how close heaven lies. As far as we know, Swedenborg did not edit his garden to mirror the things he saw in heaven. He did not need to. All Swedenborg had to do was engage with the physical world from spiritual intent, and the locks sprung open on the treasure chests of meaning. Thank you. Did anyone have questions or comments?
I'd love to have your insights on the dynamic between gardens as something that we control, which obviously has some negative connotations to it, and gardens as something that we are husbands or stewards for, that has maybe a more positive spiritual association, and how that conflict plays out.
Well, I think they're both there. And when I feel overrun by weeds, I might go more with the spontaneous need to let the garden have its own say. But I think it's a balance, and I think it's just there's a tremendous amount of work that it takes to keep a garden in a certain shape. But at the same time, if we're not appreciating the amazing vigor and life that goes on, we do so little compared to what the garden does. And I guess every person kind of finds their own balance. Do you have a thought about the balance?
Well, it seems to be a problem we all have to confront. And I know I like to control my garden, but there's times when I feel it's controlling me, which is on the negative side. sometimes that's weeds, or maybe it's disorderly, but there's something about being able to enjoy that
Yeah.
feels right.
Yeah, and I think some of what we check in with is our own state about it. You know, how are we feeling as we're doing this? Whether it seems a little more out of control this year than last year. Or there's lots of gardeners in the room. Anybody else have a thought about that? It's a great question to reflect on.
I've got another question.
Yes.
I have appreciated certain cemeteries for many years. When I was in Cincinnati, I liked Springburg Cemetery. It was only within the last year or so that I realized that this was a thing in the 19th century, to take what used to be just rows of stones and graveyards and decide we're going to make urban cemeteries, which are like parks or gardens. Do you know anything about that trend?
I don't. Anyone know about that trend? No, I do know when I was in college, one of my assignments, we were doing group work, and we had to go from Richmond up to DC. We weren't allowed to take any major roads, and we had to stop at every graveyard along the way and write a little report on it. But I don't have any answer to what you're asking. Anybody else? Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Then the point you made about gardening being gardens for the sake of usefulness was very significant. And with regard to Swedenborg Garden, am I correctly understanding that it wasn't just for the purpose of satisfying the delights of the senses, you know, the beauty of the garden, but he had vegetables in his garden as well.
He did.
And if I remember correctly, he even had animals.
He had a birdhouse, a very large birdhouse.
And I believe he also had one or two milk cows.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did. And he had a maze and a mirror house to attract visitors. There's some beautiful stories about Swedenborg going out into his garden when he's feeling distraught and going on his knees and feeling reassured. I think that a lot went on in that garden. And, you know, when you look at the drawing, which isn't up anymore, even though it was only an acre, there was a lot packed in there. Lots of different structures and flower beds and trees and a big orangery, bigger than the house even, where he's growing indoor plants.
Well, if I might make a comment,
Yes.
having been a gardener or at a very small scale in Sweden one time when I lived there, there's a lot of things that we grow here that you can't grow up in Stockholm because it's much cooler. It's very frustrating not to be able to grow, for instance, tomatoes. I even planted them against the southern wall, painted white, but it didn't work.
So we do have a few advantages over Sweden, right? All right. Well, thank you. Oh, yes.
I have to put in a good word for weeds.
Weeds.
I made most of my living off controlling weed trees and weed vegetation and vegetation management. And we always used to say, as you probably know, a weed is just something in the wrong place.
Right.
Because everything has its use. And in vegetation management today, of rights of way, which means all roads, railroads, pipelines, utilities, which is a larger area than all of New England today, in rights of way, that have to be managed and control the vegetation. And you can use stable vegetation and the concept of plant succession to control just before the final stage of succession, to use plants to control other plants. It's a whole different view, but I just had to throw that.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Yeah, thank you. I think there's time for a quick break before we have Dr. Hogan giving the next